The New Orleans Saints have set their 53-man roster, but they didn't do it without some surprises. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome in to another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much, as always, for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day. To all you everydayers out there, don't forget you can always subscribe and follow for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you never miss the latest episodes. And of course, if you want to keep the conversation going one-on-one with me, get exclusive access to our film studies, Q&As, one-on-one conversation, and much more, you can always head over to joinsubtext.com/LockedOnSaints to join a community I would love for you to be a part of. As always, I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credentialed member of the media. You can find me as a senior writer and reporter over at Saints News Network, Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation site, covering the New Orleans Saints every Tuesday on the Locked On NFL podcast, and here with you every single Monday through Friday on Locked On Saints. In today's episode of Locked On Saints, brought to you by our friends at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first order. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. On today's episode of Locked On Saints, New Orleans Saints have made their 53-man roster cutdowns. They are down to 53, but you have to know that there are a ton of moves left to be made. First thing, well, in a little bit, we're going to take a look at what some of those moves are, what's left to be done with the roster. We're going to take a look at the rookies who have earned their spots, but first, surprises are the big headline of the New Orleans Saints roster cut down as they went from an 89-man roster down to a 53-man roster. Let's start off with the big one that first made waves, the release of Bradley Roby. I've got three moves we're going to look at here. This one was the most surprising. We have not seen from the New Orleans Saints that they have enough depth and enough players that can be impactful right away in the slot to really say that they were going to be able to move on from a guy like Bradley Roby. The entire first segment of this morning's episode was all about how teams can call all they want, but how the Saints shouldn't trade him, and they didn't, but they just cut him. And if you're wondering why they cut him, if there were teams that were showing interest, it could be because the teams that were showing interest might have been bad situations that the Saints didn't want to send Bradley Roby to. Bradley Roby and the organization have good rapport. They have a good relationship. And a 7th-round pick ain't really going to get you anywhere, so here's an opportunity for you to be able to go out and find your own way, make your own path, go and join a team that you want to join. But it also leaves the door open for Bradley Roby to return, although that does not seem likely. Roby was in a situation here to where, he had already tweeted out and said goodbye to Who Dat Nation, thanked New Orleans before Anthony Davis did, was already saying, hey, I hope that these guys, they all deserve success, the fans deserve success, all of that stuff. So why move on from Bradley Roby? The only thing that's logical here is that the New Orleans Saints disagree with me. And that's fine, which would be that they believe that they do have the young depth to be able to make up for what they're losing in a veteran slot corner like Bradley Roby. And the two players that immediately come to mind are not only, of course, second-year corner Alontae Taylor, who began cross-training in the slot, but also safety Ugo Amadi. You look at the New Orleans Saints over the course of the preseason so far this year, Ugo Amadi's taken 40 snaps in the slot, allowed 6 receptions on 8 targets for 54 yards, no touchdowns, and interception, and just a 52.1 NFL passer rating. So overall, good coverage, even with a high percentage of completions and a high percentage of targets. Alontae Taylor, on the other hand, 16 snaps in the slot, according to Pro Football Reference. You've got 2 receptions allowed on just 3 targets for 54 yards, so a lot there on half as many receptions, really a third many receptions. No touchdowns, no interceptions, a 109.7 passer rating allowed. So clearly Alontae Taylor has a little bit of ground to make up here, but we know how good Alontae Taylor can be on the field. He's outstanding as an outside corner, and he played his tail off his rookie year. So the Saints believe clearly that they can put him in the slot, Continue to train him up over the course of the next couple of weeks. You're going to see some growing pains for just like any other player that's going to be changing and learning a brand new position at the beginning of the season, but they believe that he's eventually going to turn the corner there. Now, the New Orleans Saints did this last year as well. They traded away C.J. Gardner-Johnson before the season started. We all ho-hummed. We all gave them, the business over it. And then the Saints had this second-ranked NFL passing defense last year. So this one really is a let's wait and see how this all works out. The New Orleans Saints have found ways to be able to produce over on the defensive side. And even though right now it feels like you're kind of looking at it going, well, what are you thinking? Clearly, they've made right decisions before. I guess we'll see if they do it again. The other move that was one that was, that's kind of what I'm calling my don't panic move, was the release of linebacker Jaylon Smith. If you caught yesterday's episode, you know this, but in case you didn't, I'll give you a quick synopsis of this. Because of the fact that Jaylon Smith is a vested veteran, 4 years or more in the NFL, he is released as opposed to waived, meaning that he doesn't go through the waiver priority where a team can just scoop him up. He makes a decision about what he does now that he's been released by the New Orleans Saints. The good news for the Saints there is that this could be a procedural move. One of the ones that I illustrated was potentially releasing, I think I used Bradley Roby as an example, but you can use Jaylon Smith as an example here. Releasing Jaylon Smith, getting a guy like Traquan Smith or maybe offensive lineman Landon Young. Both guys made the initial 53-man roster but have been injured and were not present at practice again today. Could be moved to injured reserve where they only miss a few games in the season, as opposed to if they were moved to injured reserve before the 53-man roster cut down, their seasons would be over. That then opens up a roster spot, and then Jaylon Smith comes right back. Kind of a handshake agreement could be made, although those handshake agreements can easily turn sideways if somebody offers enough money. So definitely something that I would watch. The Jaylon Smith release is one that I would say to closely watch over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours. See if the Saints make any moves that end up opening up a roster spot for them and therefore an opportunity for Jaylon Smith to be able to make the roster. Remember, the initial 53-man roster is almost never the Week 1 roster, and the Week 2 roster is almost never the Week 1 roster. Lots of changes are still left to be made. Now, the one move that we knew could happen and that we talked about a month ago here on the show, but didn't really think that the Saints would do it, is that they trade away kicker Wil Lutz to the Denver Broncos, reuniting him with Sean Payton. And unlike what they did with Bradley Roby, where there might have been interest out there, they didn't trade him away. They give him the opportunity to choose where he goes. They instead use the opportunity to be able to look at Sean Payton and say, we'll take another draft pick, please. And then the New Orleans Saints got themselves a 7th-round draft pick in 2024. But Wil Lutz is now a Denver Bronco, meaning that the New Orleans Saints kicker is now Blake Grupe, who hit a 30-yarder, hit a 50-yarder in the last preseason game, hit a 59-yarder during training camp, but missed the 60-yarder during the preseason game. But you'll take that. Saints feel very, very excited about where Blake Grupe can get. The next piece that is kind of the last one to where we kind of braced you for this coming up to it, and we talked about it a lot, was them choosing Traquan Smith over guys like Shaq Davis and John Trey Kirkland. Shaq Davis and John Trey Kirkland, they're likely to clear waivers. They're likely to be on the Saints practice squad. But don't forget that there's a chance that you take Traquan Smith, move him to injured reserve, and therefore it opens up another spot. Same thing with Landon Young. It could happen with him as well. So we could see Shaq Davis and or John Trey Kirkland back in New Orleans in some capacity here over the course of the next 24 to 48 hours. So what we see right now is the initial 53-man roster. There's going to be a whole new roster in just a couple of days, if not one day from now. Coming up next, we're going to take a look at the rookies that earned their spot. 7 drafted rookies making the New Orleans Saints roster. But when it came to undrafted players, only the 2 specialists. What does that mean for the New Orleans Saints? Believe it or not, it's actually kind of good news. Got that coming up for you as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends at Game Time. The Game Time app is the best place to go if you're looking for those last-minute tickets. Don't miss out on your opportunity to go to the Week 1 game, the New Orleans Saints in the home opener against the Tennessee Titans. The New Orleans Saints were wearing their black helmets, their alternate helmets today in practice. Means that you could see them live on September 10th. There's the potential there. So make sure you go and check it out, the Game Time app. And hey, I'll tell you what, too. They've also got the Game Time guarantee, which means that if you always will get that best price price, but if you find tickets on the same row and in the same section for less, they're actually going to refund you not just 100% of the difference, but 110% of the difference. You can make yourself some money. So go check them out today. Snag some tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your purchase, off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. The New Orleans Saints had all 7 of their drafted rookies make the roster, but only 2 undrafted free agents. 3 of the undrafted free agents that we thought might have the most likely case to it were wide receivers Jontre Kirkland and Shaq Davis, who we just highlighted, as well as, of course, also running back Ellis Merriweather. None of the 3 make the initial 53-man roster. What does that mean for the New Orleans Saints? So as we take a look at this, I want to remind you, of course, as always, I thank you very much to all you everydayers making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day, every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So the thing that you highlight here when you look at the drafted players for the New Orleans Saints, Brian Brzee, Isaiah Foskey, Kendre Miller, Jake Haener, Nick Saldiveri, Jordan Howden, and of course A.T. Perry, all 7 of them making the roster for the New Orleans Saints and surrounded by good players. Haener joins a quarterback room of Derek Carr, Jameis Winston, Kendre Miller joins a running back room of Alvin Kamara, who doesn't count against the roster right now, but Jamal Williams, Kirk Merritt, Adam Prentice, of course, is the fullback. You get A.T. Perry in there with Chris Olave and Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed, so on and so forth. So you hear like the names there, right? Jordan Howden joins Tyrann Mathieu, Marcus May. I mean, this is cool to see, and this is a good thing for the New Orleans Saints that they had a 7-player draft class, which they haven't had in several years, a draft class of that size. And oftentimes when we're talking about the New Orleans Saints draft class, what we're usually saying, and what I was saying going into the draft this year, is that, hey, look, the Saints don't need to draft 7, 8 players, however many picks they had going into the NFL draft. They don't have that many roster spots, necessarily. So with that being the case, go in there and grab like the 5 best players you can get your hands on. All 5 of them make the roster. You're right off into the sunset and you're super happy. But instead, they pick 7, and all 7 of them make the roster. Some of them are not surprises, right? Jake Haener is not a surprise. You get the availability to carry a game day third quarterback without any necessary repercussions or anything to your roster. He doesn't count against a 46-man roster. He counts against a 53-man roster, but the Saints have usually carried 3 quarterbacks, so that's not an issue. You get guys like Isaiah Foskey and Brian Brzee. There was no surprise there in terms of them joining those rooms. But you look at guys like Jordan Howden and Nick Saldiveri and A.T. Perry, guys that were effectively in competitions or had a lot of competition around them, still landing on the roster. And you think, okay, so what is it that gives them the opportunity to be there? Well, I mean, look, A.T. Perry showed you that he deserved to be on the roster, right? Like, he had that great preseason game. He's had a nice camp. He's had some solid performances in the other 2 preseason games. He's still got some growth to go, but he's effectively the 4th, maybe 5th wide receiver on this roster, depending upon what happens with Traquan Smith. The other player that you look at is Jordan Howden. And what he shows you, Jordan Howden making the roster as a guy that can play in the slot, that can play special teams, that can play split safety, deep safety, play down in the box, just has that versatility, kind of a Taysom Hill of the defense, if you will. So I think you look at all 7 of the players, but those 3 players in particular, including Nick Saldiveri, who can play guard, he can play tackle, all these other pieces. There's a ton that you look at there and go, okay, these guys have earned their spots, and that's good news for New Orleans. It means that, again, they've drafted well and their scouting departments do well. I mean, look at the 53-man roster in terms of the players that they drafted that are still on the roster. At running back, you've got Alvin Kamara. At tight end, okay, so this one's a little bit tougher, right? Because at tight end, you've got Jimmy Graham, who they drafted. He went away. He comes back. I don't think that necessarily counts. Juwan Johnson was an undrafted free agent. Michael Thomas, Chris Olave, Keith Kirkwood, Rashid Shaheed, A.T. Perry, Traquan Smith. These are all guys that were either drafted or undrafted that showed up as rookies. Their entire starting offensive line is drafted. If you include Andres Pete as the starting left guard, if not, then 4 out of the 5, and then one of your solid backups, 2 of your solid backups, 3 of your solid backups. If you include Landon Young, he's a guy that makes it. There's so many players on this roster that have been drafted or that showed up as undrafted free agent rookies that make this roster and not only make the initial roster, but stick around on the roster for years. Cam Jordan's going into year 12. A guy like Pete Werner, Zach Bond, those guys are draft picks. Lattimore is a draft pick. Adebo, Taylor, all these guys are draft picks. And so it just kind of goes right along with what we've seen from the New Orleans Saints scouting department and their ability to be able to get players that can have an impact and that can contribute. The other 2 rookies that make the roster, and this is where things are a little bit different than what we're used to seeing. We're used to seeing at least one player on either side of the football, offense and defense, being undrafted free agents and making the initial roster. The Saints don't have that this year. The only 2 undrafted free agents to make the roster were Blake Grupe and Lou Hedley. And if you remember right, going into this, I only had 2 rookies that I even toyed with making the roster, Ellis Merriweather and then Shaq Davis. It was neither of those guys. What I'm learning is that 53-man rosters are a lot like mock drafts. You're always going to be wrong. But Blake Grupe and Lou Hedley are your only 2 undrafted free agents to make the roster, and those are your 2 specialists, your new kicker and your new punter. So what this tells me is that the Saints drafting is still where it should be and that they're still doing well there. Jeff Ireland, Mickey Loomis, all these guys are doing great. All of the scouting, it's all working still. But what it also tells me is that this roster has a lot more veteran talent on it than it has in previous years, where you don't see the undrafted free agents making the roster anymore, at least at this time, right? We'll see what happens over the course of the next couple of days if that changes. But you're seeing a lot of these younger undrafted free agent guys make more and more rosters, and we've seen it in New Orleans for a long time, but not this year. And one of the big reasons why is because the Saints have a lot of veteran talent. They're an older, more experienced roster, and that's a good sign. That's a good thing. But the guys that they invested in and and used those draft picks for, the guys that they looked at and said, we want these players on our team, and they went out and grabbed those guys, here they are. They're all on the roster. So it's great. It's a good thing. It's a good sign to see that. And the balance between the drafted roster versus the undrafted rookie roster and the way that looks, that actually goes in the New Orleans Saints' favor as well. So something you should consider thinking about in terms of where this roster is and how it can be better this year than it was last year. Big part of it, veteran experience. Look at the free agents that have made the roster, right? Lonnie Johnson Jr., Ugo Amadi, guys that you're adding in like Jaylon Smith could potentially be back. The additions of course, Colin Saunders and Nathan Shepard, Derek Carr, of course, the headliner at that conversation, Jamal Williams, Foster Moreau, Jimmy Graham technically, right? So there's a lot of that you can see to where the Saints, even on the pro personnel side, you look at Michael Parrington in that case, Kai Harley, these guys are making it all work. They're all making it work. So good stuff. Good news for the New Orleans Saints there. There were still some of those confusing moves, though, and because of those confusing moves, we know that there's more stuff on the way. What could be on the way for the New Orleans Saints as they take their 53-man roster, their initial 53-man roster, and move closer to their Week 1 53-man roster. Got that coming up for you next here as we continue on and wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with a look at what could be next for the New Orleans Saints. When we got to practice today, we got to see effectively what the 53-man roster was, but there were a few players that were absent. Taysom Hill was present during stretch, but then left. Jameis Winston's dealing with a wrist injury, which is something that happened during the game against the Houston Texans, not expected to be significant. But then we also saw 4 more players that weren't present. Traquan Smith, Landon Young, safety JT Gray, and of course, cornerback Marshawn Lattimore. Those 4 players, or at least 3 of those 4 players, I would say, could end up finding their way to injured reserve. And that's what could be next for the New Orleans Saints, and therefore opening up roster spots for some of the favorites that you saw leave, still coming back before all is said and done. that's where we're headed next here as we continue on with today's episode. And I appreciate you as always. So all the everydayers out there, whether you're watching live or later, whether it's your first time or your next time, I appreciate you very much for being here and making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. So what's next for the New Orleans Saints? We have a big thing that we can look at here. Traquan Smith, JT Gray, Landon Young. All three of these players dealing with injuries more substantially. Traquan Smith, Landon Young. Those two players have been injured and have been absent for quite a while, with the exception of during the Houston Texans game. They were in street clothes. They were on the sideline. They were present, which is progress. It's good to see them with the team and all those other things. But how close are they to getting back out on the field? Dennis Allen told us that Traquan Smith was still a little bit of a ways away. So if we isolate down to Traquan Smith, who is the guy that a lot of people kept saying, there's no way he makes the roster, there's no way he makes the roster, there's no way he makes the roster. But with the injury, it actually opens up an opportunity for New Orleans. They could take Traquan Smith as early as tomorrow, move him to injured reserve, and then because of that, open up a roster spot. And then some of those fan favorites, Shaq Davis, Jaylon Smith, they could potentially come back to the New Orleans Saints lineup. The other thing to consider is that there are hundreds of other players that have been released today that could be of interest to New Orleans. So watch for them to put out waiver claims, things like that. There are some players on this list that if the right opportunity were to present itself by adding a waived veteran or a vested veteran or something like that, that could lead to the release of some of these players in order to make room for a veteran at the same position. So that's something to watch out for here, right? How married are the New Orleans Saints to, I'm just going to pick a name here, let's say Landon Young. How married are they to him? If there's another veteran offensive tackle out there that they could bring in, a la Trey Turner this offseason, and say, okay, actually, we're not going to put Landon Young on IR. We're going to move on from him entirely, and we're going to sign in this veteran in that space. Am I saying that the Saints are going to do that? No. I think what's more likely, because I know how much New Orleans likes Landon Young, that's a reason why it's an easy example to use, is that they could move Landon Young to injured reserve, have him out for the first less than a handful of games in the season, bring somebody else in, and then make a decision after those 4 games are up, and be able to either put Landon Young back or waive him with an injury settlement. So there's a lot of different ways for you to see exactly where this could go. And remember right now, Alvin Kamara also doesn't count against the roster. So in 3 games, when he does, what does that mean for a Kirk Merritt? Or what does that mean for an extra defensive back perhaps, or something to that effect? So there's a lot of things to kind of balance and watch out. But the thing that you should know is that this is not the final 53-man roster, right? This is the initial 53-man roster. A lot of things are going to change between now and week 1. Not even just between now and the end of the season. A lot's going to change between now and week 1. And then even more can change between week 1 and week 2. Why? Because at that point, after the week 1 game, any veteran contracts or really any 1-year deals that you give to a player are non-guaranteed. That means that those players that are signed after week 1 get paid by game checks, not by a guaranteed, here's your 1 point whatever million dollars, depending upon how many years experience they have in the NFL or don't. And instead, it all comes down to all of that. And I see the question here again, Traquan Smith on the roster and on the team. Why? Again, you don't know if he's on the team, right? This can change moving forward. Traquan Smith seems like a very, very good option to move to injured reserve, open up that roster spot, and maybe bring Jaylon Smith back. Maybe bring Shaq Davis back. There's a lot of opportunity for all that. And oh, by the way, there's still a 16-man practice squad to be filled out as well, which will begin on Wednesday. So it'll be a whole new group of 16 players, 6 of which can be veterans, not just young players, 6 of which can be veterans, brought back to this roster that not only sit on the practice squad, but remember, you also have the ability to elevate players on game day 3 times in a season and then make the decision whether or not you're just going to add them to your active roster for the rest of the year. So there's a lot of opportunity here for the Saints to continue to churn players around and continue to do all of this. So I would say watch for all of this to continue to shift, continue to change over the course of not only the next 24 to 48 hours, but the next 2 weeks, the next 3 weeks, right? The first month of the season. And then, of course, all of the other pieces that are going to be out there. The The last thing that I wanted to look at is amongst the list of released players, who are some of the players that I think would be good, would have the opportunity to be able to come back for the practice squad. Now, the fact of the matter is that every player that the Saints moved on from, whether waived or released, can be brought back to the practice squad. The difference between being waived and released is that if you're released, you can sit around, you can make your own decision, you can kind of do your own thing. If you're waived, then you're subject to waivers. So you got to make it through waivers first, where a team can claim you, and whoever's got the best waiver priority could end up coming back up and bringing you in. But guys like Jaylon Smith, a guy like Bradley Roby, if he doesn't find a new home, a guy like Darrell Williams, Ty Summers, Ryan Conley, and let's just say J.P. Holtz. That could be your 6 veterans that make the practice squad. But more than likely, there will also be a veteran from another team that got let go that they can also bring back in. 10 rookies or 10 younger players that you could bring back and have on your practice squad as well. I wouldn't be surprised to see Jonathan Abram in that number. I wouldn't be surprised to see a guy like Nick Anderson, Kawan Baker. You've got players like Shaq Davis and Jerron Cage and Lucas Krull and Nico Lalos and Anthony Orji, as well as Nick Anderson, of course. And then, of course, Shaq Davis and Troy Pride Jr. and Calvin Throckmorton. Like, there's so many of these players that could all find their way right back to the New Orleans Saints practice squad and not only be there on the practice squad, so they're there to help with the scout team and all that other stuff, but those are guys that can see playing time during the 2023 season. So if you're worried about a player that did not make the initial 53-man roster that you really wanted to see with the team, the dream's not over. The story's not over. These players still have a lot of opportunity to get back on this team, whether it's through the 53-man roster or through the practice squad, and even see game time and even see playing time down the way. So we'll just continue to keep an eye out and watch for it. Coming up on tomorrow morning's episode, okay, we're going to do another episode looking at the 53-man roster. What are the weakest positions? What are the strongest positions? What are the positions most in flux and in question? And what are the positions that we need to see the most evidence of improvement from? We're going to look at all of that, as well as, of course, some of the other things that could potentially happen going into this next season. Remember, there's still a Marcus May suspension that can come down at any point as well. So there's a lot of things to keep an eye out on here. We're going to identify them and look at those strongest, weakest, most in question, and most need for improvement, or most need to show improvement position groups in tomorrow morning's episode. So I appreciate you, as always, for coming through for another episode of Locked On Saints and making us your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to come right back here tomorrow. We're going to have all more for you tomorrow morning. As always, I thank you very much for making this show and myself a part of your day, a part of your routine. Thank you for saying yes to me on the show. And as always, if you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, Nola. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.